Hello, and welcome to the Conversations in Time podcasts from the ORC. In this podcast, the guys will be talking about historical what-ifs, or counterfactual history for the aficionados in the audience.
Hello, and welcome to a Conversations in Time podcast. I'm John N.
And I'm Ian G.
You remember that time?
I did.
Jolly good. Right, so today is a slightly different podcast. We've decided that we're going to have a series-based approach to our podcasts now, and this will be the end of Series 1, or Season 1, to our North American friends, so that we can look at ways of improving the podcast for Series 2. And one of the bigger things that we want to try and do for Series 2 is to have some guests who may be better informed or at least have an opinion on the subjects that we pick. So making it more entertaining for our listeners, maybe getting more publicity because the guests may have the opportunity to highlight the fact that they've been on our podcast. That's what we're going to do, isn't it, Ian?
Yes, but of course, if we get to the end of Series 2 and we've had 15 podcasts and no guests, well... But anyway, the box...
Oh, no, we've definitely got a guest for the first episode.
That's true.
And I think the idea will be to have our first episode, just as a spoiler, will be about what if there were no antibiotics. So we have a...
Which is ironic, because I'm sat here on antibiotics. Although they're not making a huge difference. So, but then again, I think it was I've got a, so apologies for any coughing. At least I don't have something, but I've got something else instead. But yeah, but no, that'll be good.
That's right. Yeah, the other things that we want to try and do as well is to improve the quality. I think that's we're definitely going to, as Ian Russell's on his microphone, I'm going to say improve the audio quality. We've had a few issues on a few of the podcasts, which ultimately are due to our inexperience and not knowing what we're doing. I think you have to remember that this is an amateur podcast. We're not professionals here. The schools we went to were public schools, i.e. open to the public, not public schools.
Like 93% of the population, and thank goodness 87% of the government now as well.
That's right, yeah.
But anyway, let's not get into all that again. We won.
But yeah.
Suck it up if you like it.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about the election in a minute, because that's one of the things that we wanted to talk about on this closing episode of Series 1. But yeah, it's just ultimately we're a couple of ordinary blokes who enjoy talking a lot about history, and the what-if scenarios came out of that, mainly because we're not historians. Didn't get to
the thing that
in school, like most historians that you hear at podcasts these days.
Those of you listening may realise is that history is not just certainly modern interpretation of history is not just in 1652 this happened and in 1941 this happened. Yes, obviously that's the bulk of it, but to make history interesting, people who write books and do things on TV these days, they contextualise it, and as soon as you contextualise history, you're straight into what ifs. You may not call it what ifs, you may not call it alternate histories, but as soon as you try and contextualise why X happened and Y happened, it's, well, what if X and Y hadn't happened? And even if you only make a quick reference to it, it's making you think. It's making you think, well, what, that didn't necessarily need to happen, and that's a what if. So people can be a bit sniffy about what ifs. It's always, John and I discuss this, it always makes me laugh a little bit when, I'm not having a go at them as such, but when well-known podcasters, historical podcasters all say, well, that's a what if, we don't do what ifs, and then they continue to speak about it for the next 15 minutes.
Yeah, that's right.
Because it's a natural thing to do. I mean, it's just, but anyway, that's
I think with the things with some of our what ifs as well is that we don't try and look at a specific, what if and I'll give you an example, because this was something that we heard on a different podcast where they were essentially dismissing what ifs as something that you shouldn't do. And it was, what if the ground and the Battle of Agincourt hadn't have been muddy? And it was like, we don't, our what ifs aren't about the minutiae of there's a specific thing that happened or happens or doesn't happen. It's more about a an event, and we don't worry too much about what caused that to happen. It's just, what if it didn't happen, or something different did?
No, exactly.
And I mean, I think for me, one of the things that sorry, I was talking over you.
So I was talking over you. So my apologies. It's geopolitical. It's the great sweep of history rather than the minute detail, because the minute detail rarely has any difference.
That's right, yeah. And I think one of the things that I would like to think that we've pulled out of a few, not all of them, but a few of the podcasts that we've done, is almost thinking, well, I'm glad that what happened, and there wasn't an alternative. And it actually makes you think about what did happen, which is what the historians want you to think about. Is, well, what did happen then?
Yeah.
So when you come up with some conclusion, you think, bloody hell, I'm glad that didn't happen, because what would the scenario, what the world geopolitics would be like now would be awful, or certainly a lot worse than they are currently. And I think that's been one of the pleasant surprises for me in terms of doing this podcast, is that it makes you wonder, or makes you consider, well, thank goodness that didn't happen.
Yes, but to be fair, we haven't delved into some fairly horrendous things that we could have done, the Holocaust and stuff, because these things did happen, didn't they? But yes, you're right. In the great sweep of things could have gone an awful lot worse in many cases. But some of the stuff we don't want people to have nightmares, what we're talking about. So we haven't done many, if any. All right, well, exception argument of these
who are going to suddenly wake up in a sweat because they've listened to me and you talk, or maybe hearing us talk, rather than the actual subject matter.
With the exception of the Manhattan Project, which is, obviously is the practical application of which was fairly horrendous. But it's. But no, you're right. It's. I mean, just on something I heard the other day, which did make me think about the great sweep of history versus the technical detail of what ifs. There was a guy talking about the first Gulf War in 1991, where the Americans had this, and the British had these sophisticated third-generation tanks, M1s, Challenger 1s, and all the rest of it. And the Iraqis had these T-72s, which are reasonably good, Soviet design, arguably the same. But some American military person pointed out, well, if the American army had been driving T-72s and the Iraqis had been driving M1s, the Americans would have still won. So it's not about the kit. It's what you do with the kit, and it's not about this machine gun's better than that machine gun. Therefore, we would have won, and the Spitfire is better than the Messerschmitt. Wars, certainly wars, and we don't just do wars, obviously, but wars are not won by kit. It's about intelligence and strategy and industrial power and all the rest of it. And I think we've tried to encourage thinking along those lines, haven't we? Rather than, well, if only the Germans had developed their V weapons better.
Absolutely.
M82 was a fighter rather than a bomber, blah, 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 blah. Yes, all right, more people would have died, but the end result wouldn't have been any different. It's
That's right. I think that you do get some of these, we've heard on other podcasts, other historians, sort of poo-pooing what ifs, but they're talking about that type of what if they'd have had this rather than that.
Rather than samurais versus...
Well, samurais versus knights.
Yeah. Just, those are not what ifs. Those are
a fantasy,
top trumps, aren't they? Yes.
Yeah, that's just fantasizing.
For American listeners, top trumps was a game of cards where, if you had a tank with a bigger gun, you won. Nothing to do with the adjectives that are available person who used to be the president. But so so it's how it
coffee up, Ian. Coffee up.
Interesting noises. It's how it affects people, how it affects the sweep of history. I think that's where it becomes interesting, because you can go into some really interesting stuff. Potato.
Well, you can, yeah.
The potato, development of Western Europe, or not Western Europe as such, because it was hundreds of years ago, but the development of Europe, in fact, totally dependent.
I think that's one of the things that we do, if we put as much, the effort that we do put in, and I mean, fair enough, we don't have a team of researchers, there's just the two of us, so we do try and come up with what ifs, which aren't essentially obvious as such. So that they're not the usual, what if the Japanese had won at Pearl Harbor type.
Well, the Japanese did win at Pearl Harbor, but no,
well, all right. The
what if they'd sunk the carriers or whatever? But yeah.
Yeah, what if they sunk the carriers? Yeah, that sort of stuff. People who have their specifics, it's... I think we've had one, haven't we, which would arguably would be classed as... Well, lots of people talk about this one. That was Dunkirk being a disaster. Well, it was a disaster, but I'm trying to think of the others that we've done. I think that they've been fairly not unusual. I mean, they're just not well thought of, or they're not necessarily.
The first one we did, the what if the atomic bomb was says what if the Manhattan Project had failed? I've never seen that really. Obviously, there's we were of an age where we've read a few books, and I've certainly never seen a book of that type. And in the modern environment, I've never seen anybody on Twitter postulating that. And Twitter isn't always about slanging people off. There's lots of interesting stuff in Twitter, but I've never seen anybody post, and I'm not going to call it the letter before Y, before Z or Z. It's but so that was an interesting one, and we talked about some of the aspects of discovering the new world.
That's right.
That again had a massive impact, and we've not seen it. There may be, but I'm not disputing them. There's probably a book on everything, but we're talking about stuff that you would find in an average bookstore, not we had 600 editions made in 1973, but I think we've done quite well in that. And we've resisted the urge, despite my natural leanings towards it, to just do everything with the Second World War, because it's so huge and there's so many things. We've done, I don't know, 4 or 5, I don't know, but we've tried to keep it broad, and I hope those of you who are listening, try and appreciate that.
Well, I think that's part of the reasons that we would like to have a guest is that you do have a level of knowledge about the Second World War, which is why we have done more episodes there than anywhere else, because you're
as Al Murray
at least a reasonable depth.
Yeah, as Al Murray, who's
the history of it.
Quite a well-known comedian in the UK, and there's a Second World War or World War II enthusiast. It's an affliction, but it's all about when I was brought up or born 20 years after the Second World War. My teachers at school, many of them had been in the war. Not that they talked about it, but you were aware they had. The British films, American films in the 50s and 60s were being shown on TV when I was growing up. Where there was comics, there was the plastic models of tanks and aeroplanes. The entire. I lived near an RAF base, so there was a Battle of Britain Day every year. So you were surrounded it when I was growing up, and Al Murray's even done a TV program on that very basis. He's slightly younger than me, but he's of that generation. But yes, so I'm reasonably familiar with it. But I've enjoyed the other conversations as well. The ones about America. You're much more knowledgeable than I am, John, but I do have an interest.
I think it's much more. I just take more of an interest.
The thing the only thing I struggle a bit with some of the North America stuff about the War of Independence or the Revolution, however you want to call about it, is that some of the books get very quickly drawn into sort of, how to describe it, with sort of arcane names or people named people who come and go, and you think, who was he and what did he do again? And so there seems to be so many characters knocking about the revolution. Paul Revere, and then there's various other people, and you think, well, and then some of those are myth, and then some aren't, and then there's difficult. The Second World War is quite linear. There's defeat, and then there's rebuilding, and then there's the war at sea, and then there's a war in the air, and then there's North Africa, and then there's Pacific. Whereas the war in North America in the 70s and 80s, it just seems to be a bit of this, and they all stop, and then nothing happens for a year and a half, and then something happens over there, and then somebody's defeated where it doesn't seem to make any difference, and then the French come in and blockade the British, and they're struggling a bit, and so it's difficult.
Well, it isn't like that, unfortunately. And to be fair, we haven't actually done a podcast about the Revolutionary War, which is whether it's called the UK. But we've touched on it. And maybe we will do. We will. But I would like to do one about that time period, but it isn't necessarily about the Revolutionary War. But that's something for the future.
But what I was trying to say is the reason that many people, and myself included, and even us on our part, you're drawn to the Second World War because it has a sort of a logic to it. You could put 5 bullet points. Most people of a certain age or a certain education could put 5 bullet points as to why the Germans were defeated. I couldn't explain to you why the British were defeated in North America in 5 bullet points. I couldn't explain to you.
I know you couldn't because, one of the reasons is because nobody's ever talked about it. It's not something that's discussed at school. It's not part of English history in terms of education, and I don't get the impression that it's really muchness in the US. Well,
No, it's all
US either.
mythologized.
There's a lot of mythology. That's part of the issue with understanding the reality of what happened. I mean, there's no doubt that it was in the first couple of years before the war with France, and then went to war with Spain, and then it was at war with Spain, and then it was at war with the Dutch. So we were at war with 4 different, nations, including the US. The first 2 years, I mean, one of the Washington and whatever did very well. You have to accept that he did an exceptional job. But there were times when he came close to disaster. There were reasons why he managed to essentially escape. It was, and there are periods where, the way the warfare was done in that time period was when it was winter, you stopped because too cold. Although they did have
I get that warfare in those days was very much, I'll meet you tomorrow at 3:00 in this field. I mean, I exaggerate slightly, but there was a degree.
Well, if they could find each other, I mean,
well, exactly.
They couldn't. When you're marching down from Canada, and you're trying to find an army that's marching up from New York, it's a big country.
Indeed.
And
you had to defeat the army in the field to win. You couldn't. There was very little of this, defending towns and all the rest of it. It was you wouldn't. Yeah, there was some of that. Don't get me wrong, but the. So perhaps we can find some amateur American listener / historian who can help us educate ourselves and anybody who's interested.
I mean, like you say, I have more of an interest, and the interest is because I've got family in the US, so I've got more of an interest in learning more about the history, and then you find out more about the mythology. I mean, everybody slags off the English. Yeah, that's just something.
Or the British, indeed, John. The British. Was at that point.
Well, it was, but there was a lot of Scots.
Indeed. And Irish and Germans, as we know, but they don't care about them. Essentially, mercenaries. But
we are where we are. Isn't it?
I mean, I made a mistake because you'd piqued my interest a little bit, and I would 100% urge people not to do this. I made the mistake of watching the film Revolution a few months ago, and my God, what a dreadful film! Al Pacino, Al Pacino apparently thought it was Oscar material, unbelievable. It just shows you that you got no idea what's happening in front of the camera. And the most laughable thing about it, at the end of it, Al Pacino and some young man go off somewhere into inverted commas upstate New York, which was actually filmed in Norway and looks exactly like what you think Norway looks like, and doesn't look like what you have in the mind, because the Norwegian Tourist Board gave them money to do so. It's just the most dreadful film. So I learned nothing whatsoever about anything is watching that film, other than not to watch it ever again. But anyway, I do digress. But there's lots of fascinating topics out there, and I think if we can find, anybody listening, there might be somebody in America listening to this who would like to get in touch, and we can have a chat and see if if we can take it forward. Why not? And that's true. I think we did. I mean, one of the. Sorry, you're going to say something there.
I was just going to say, ultimately, we're just amateurs. We're not. Yeah. This isn't a professional thing. We don't make any money out of this.
Trust me, not forcing you, we don't. I mean, I was going to say that one of the interesting conversations we did have about outside the Second World War was about the African civilizations that were
the African empires, in
existence in the 1400s, 1500s, which could have, boomed or exploded into in the same way that European, and to a certain extent Chinese ones did, but didn't from and I thought that was really interesting. We did get a little bit of feedback on that, which was good, through the mysteries of YouTube, in fact, but. Not the greatest platform.
Yes, that was a mystery in series one, wasn't it? It was. We did that African Empire one, and then 100 people listened to it or watched it on YouTube. It was quite shocking. Wow, this is good. No, but they didn't listen to any more. But how they found the episode, YouTube is beyond me, because we can't find it. It's.
I know it's quite a rich theme, and I know that there have been TV programs about it and books. Not that necessarily I've read tons of them, but I am aware that there are books on it, and it is a fascinating topic. So I think there is definitely a rich theme, a rich vein, whatever the term is, of stuff that we have only scratched the surface. That said, we'll always come back to the Second World War occasionally. Can't resist it, but and hey, I'm joking. Up to a point.
Well, we'll run out. Sort of the unusual ones. Like the Hitler assassination. I thought that was a good one. Just one of those things where you don't think about it. And then when you delve deeper into it, and then you realise there were several assassination attempts over 3 or 4 years, and how the hell he got away with it is, it was just luck.
Yes, and also
but unbelievable luck. Look at the devil.
Remind yourself that the people attempting to assassinate him were highly unpleasant individuals as well. They were hardly the Germans of the post-war era, pacifists and reluctant, joiners in.
Yeah, I mean, they weren't all. I don't know whether any of them were trying to stop the war. It was
no, they were trying to stop losing the war. Which is a different kettle of fish altogether. I mean, that but anyway, let's not get into too much. But in principle, they were all about keeping the war in the east going while trying to stop the war in the west. Yes, still very much the German nationalist outlook and all the rest of it. But yeah, so that was an interesting one. I'm trying to think if he had any duds. I mean, I'll say hand on heart, the ones I'm most uncomfortable with, and the readers probably. I mean, it won't surprise you to learn, dear listener, as the expression goes, that John, in fact I don't, John does a little bit of editing to remove the ums and the ahs and the OSH1Ts, but I discovered the other day that one of my favourite podcasts, which is done by a couple of youngish guys called Fighting on Film, they were talking about that as well, and they come across as very slick. But the and ah count is usually the highest on my side around sort of medieval stuff. I mean, I don't. It was never done in the curriculum when I was at school, mostly because most medieval stuff in the United Kingdom is based around English kings and queens and stuff, and I'm from Scotland, so we're not going to spend any time in the Scottish curriculum talking about English kings and queens until they start merging together, which is post Renaissance really. So I know virtually nothing about it. So other than what I've garnered from a bit of googling.
I think the other one that for me was a dud, or didn't go the way that I thought it would do, and I suppose in hindsight, now I think about it, either we didn't do enough research or it's just not a valid what if, was the Romans and steam engines.
Well, actually, I actually quite enjoyed that.
Did you? It just didn't go in the direction I thought it was going to go, or I thought...
I do know, and I just did it there. I do know that my sister, who said she listened to the podcast in Australia, said I should stop talking over you all the time, and that was when I felt after the event that I did all the talking, not because you had nothing to say, but because I just did all the talking. So I don't
know. I think that was because that was the second one. I think that one of the things that we learned as we went through 16 or 17 that we've got is that to at least make some notes. And I hadn't done any notes. That was just totally off the cuff. We were just talking and we started and off we went. And I think that was part of the reason why maybe what I thought the direction, and maybe I should have been a bit stronger. But then if I'd have had some notes, I might have pushed some of the issues. But it was just, it went off and sort of faded to me. And I thought it had a stronger case. But
no, you're right. Right. I think
maybe it was a dud for me because it went your way and it didn't go my way. And
my arc of argument generally, and the thousands of listeners out there no doubt agree, he says tongue in cheek, is that I, other than coughing a lot, my arc of argument 9 times out of 10, or 8 times out of 10, is it made no difference. And I think my argument was, well, the Romans could have had this and they could have had that, but what difference would it have made? Because they still had these thousands of barbarians at the gates, and having steam engines would make no difference. And I still think that was the case. But I suppose that was quite disappointing, because you could think, well, you could have Romans in togas whizzing by on steam engines, and then 400 years later, the Visigoths and the Vandals and all the rest of them, and the various other people would just go rampaging through Rome, and then they have these internecine battles and corruption and all the rest of it, and it just gradually goes away. And would the technology be lost? I think it probably would have been lost. Not completely lost, but it wouldn't have been developed. So I suppose that was a disappointing...
Well, the Roman technology disappeared.
Yes, so it was more of a disappointing conclusion. Maybe that's why it didn't feel... because it didn't have a exciting ending, if you know what I mean.
Maybe that. You enjoyed it. I just thought it was a bit more of a dud on my part. And... I think from then, I tried to do a bit more thinking, making a few notes, just so that I've got some valid points to try and bring up to put what I thought across, So anyway, we were just talking about that, which ones we liked and which ones, we thought weren't quite up to scratch. But I think that we let's face it, we're just patting ourselves on the back and inflating our own egos here, which is not something we do very often.
No, but then I think it'd be worthwhile just mentioning a couple of things that we haven't talked about that we came up with, and we say we. I mean, to go, for the benefit of the listener, John comes up with 90% of them, if not 95% of them, and that's a good thing. But I still think the one that I'm glad we didn't do, and maybe we will one day, is what if there'd been no horses? Because it seemed to me that would have been that.
No, I still think we're going to do that.
Well, I think that will digress into an awful lot of conversations about camels, and
well, it might do. But so just for our listeners, so one of the what ifs that we're looking at doing is, and it's not necessarily there being no horses. I mean, if you actually look at the history of the evolution of Equidae, we're talking about the actual what if now, which we shouldn't be, because we should talk about this on the actual what if. It's interesting when you look at it, and there could have been. What I will say is that Equidae, so that's where horses originated, horses, ponies, donkeys, zebras, they evolved in North America, but then became extinct. And it was only because they'd migrated into other parts of the world before this is, I can't remember how many years ago now. It's obviously
one of the ice ages or something.
No, it's further back. I think it's further.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, I think it's more than. For some reason, I've got 60,000 years ago, and I'm sure it's like.
Well, that's roughly one of the ice ages, isn't it? I mean, there's.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I mean, not one that caused the Bering Strait to be, but
well, that's what I'm getting confused with. Is I think that.
Yeah, but there's been more than one, because Homo sapiens were around, but they weren't around enough to migrate to North Africa 60,000 years ago.
I think it was in terms of millions of years ago. This and the land masses hadn't split as they wouldn't be as recognisable as they are today. But ultimately, it was the animal evolved and then went extinct. And it was only because it had migrated somewhere else that it actually survived. But we'll come on to that. I still think that's a very interesting.
Well, we'll see. I'm sure we can make it an interesting one, but I'm sure it would very quickly be a conversation about camels and bullocks and things. But
let's not. If it is, then I'll try and move it onto a different.
Yeah. No, sorry. What was that? There was another one off the top of my head that we haven't done. Slightly left field. Well, not so much. It was not so much. Something we haven't done, which you said we were going to do, was more a couple of conversations around technology. We haven't done huge. We did.
Yeah, I think one of the things with the technology ones, and I'd like to try and do this in series too, is to have a guest on to talk about some of the technology ones, because I think that could be interesting. Because one of the things that is difficult, I think, is that when you talk about more modern history, because the world's been arguably fairly peaceful, there aren't many what ifs. In theory, in terms of what would have had a significant geopolitical.
Well, I think you need a bit of distance, don't you? That's the thing. You need a bit of distance to look back.
Well, there is, which is why the technology ones do have more of an impact, because they've been world changing. Some of them.
Well, maybe it's because and the listeners might relate to this depending on how old they are. Maybe it's because we're of an age where some of the technology that we take for granted today, that we could say, what if this was invented, didn't in actual fact exist. It may have existed in labs, but obviously we were children. There was no mobile phones, cell phones. There was no flat screen TVs. There was no computers. Well, there was, but there wasn't. There wasn't broadband, fiber optic cables. There was, but there wasn't. So it's the what if of how could we have survived without integrated circuits? Well, people of a certain age had TVs with valves and tubes in them, and it was still a TV. And the essence of looking at it is not different.
No, that's right. So there's definitely going to. I think that's a good one. I think is looking at.
Yeah, but it's a question of somebody who's 25 may say, "How the hell did you ever survive without a mobile phone?" And I can get that. But I remember how we did survive without a mobile phone. You agreed to meet somebody at 7:00 in the pub, or outside the bus stop or something, and and that's what you did. Or sometimes you didn't because they didn't turn up, but.
And that's part of what we want to try and discuss. And I mean, if this has somebody who is, if we do have a guest, then potentially we have some. The guest doesn't have to be as old as us, couple of old duffers. There could be somebody who's a bit younger, who maybe doesn't know what the world was like without some of this technology. It's but it's been around a long time.
Yeah,
and
the thing I think if you look at technology.
We both remember black and white TVs before there was even colour TVs.
Yes, indeed. But I suppose the answer is the problem we've got is people who have experience the before of the what if is that you think, well, you just didn't do that, or you did it in a different way. Whereas if you go back further, how did people survive without? I do remember as a child thinking, how the hell did people survive without TV? What the hell did they do all day? Well, listen to the radio, or they were at work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week for a start. But it's. But yeah, let's get into the technology a bit more, because technology is fascinating.
The more modern what ifs are more technologically based, I think, is what we're saying.
But as we've seen, they are having social impacts, aren't they?
Absolutely.
I mean, literally, social media is having a social impact on people's lives, good, bad, or indifferent. The communications revolution is making a difference to how people keep in touch across the country. You speak regularly to people thousands of miles away, as do I. Not as regularly as I should, perhaps, but certainly through messaging and stuff with extended family, or family who were, just 30 years ago, people who would emigrate and you would never see them ever again, potentially. Or you see them once or something, or they come back for...
Then somebody would write a letter these days, but anyway,
well, exactly. But then,
one of those is...
If you can send somebody a WhatsApp halfway around the world and it feels like they're 3 miles up the street, it literally does feel like 3 miles up the street. It's not the same, obviously, but, it's a massive change, and the impact of that is huge. But human nature being what it is, you take it for granted, and I think it's a question of distance from the event. That you can look back at something in 1940, which even then doesn't seem that necessarily that long to some people. It does to us, obviously, but 1800 something, that's a completely different planet.
Yeah, that's right.
1975, yes, you can make lots of documentaries on Channel 5 about it being a long time ago, but it doesn't really seem that long ago. Really, is the world really that different? Well, it might seem that different in another 25 years. Looking back in 1975, I still boggle.
You're boggled.
I'm boggled when you hear music on the radio from the 1980s, some of which has not necessarily stood the test of time, but 3/4 of it has. And you think, my goodness, if I was listening to an equivalently old song from 1940, it'd be Bing Crosby, or what's the name, Dame Doodah, who died?
Vera Lynn. Or a World War II flipping.
Well, no, but they were just talking. But I'm talking 40 years ago. Bing Crosby, Vera Lynn,
Action Archer.
Right. Well, yeah, just near the end of the war. But yeah, Frank Sinatra.
Elvis Presley.
Well, but then he was 50s. But yeah, there comes a time where you think, it's just time has slowed down, or you could argue that development has slowed down, if that's the right word.
Well, we'll have to put that on the list. That's maybe
because you think about it,
we can have it as whatever happened to.
I think development has slowed down. I mean, the technology may have changed, but the impact of people's lives, I think, is slowed down because my dad.
We're actually starting to talk about what we're going to talk about.
Well, exactly, but that's what's added to the list. But people had cars in the 1970s. People have cars now. All right, the cars are all these widgets and clever things, but essentially you get in a car and you go somewhere. My grandparents didn't have cars in the 1930s. So, they might have done in America. Not they were in America, but America being a much more automotive-driven economy in that period. So the changes between now and then, on the face of it, don't look that big. But between the 30s and the 70s are absolutely huge. Penicillin and all the rest of it, to your TVs, telecommunications. So why did it slow down so much? Why, we invented everything that's there to be invented. So it's something to have a chat. But anyway, we digress.
So So hopefully people are listening to us and thinking, well, there's going to be a rich vein of opportunities for Series 2. And let's hope that comes
more
true.
Waffle.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we like talking.
Waffle.
What happens when you get older.
Waffle, as Albury calls it, yeah.
Right. So let's finish by talking about the election. We've had a couple of episodes where we talked about the build-up. The elections happened. The Labour Party won by a very large majority. I think from both Ian and myself's perspective, we haven't hidden this. We're both pleased that that's happened. So what do you think then, Ian?
I was chatting to this about the other day with a mutual friend who's not British but has lived here for a long time. I was saying it's good news. If you look at what's happened from my perspective, what's happened the last few days, the adults are back in charge. We haven't got charlatans and circus entertainers in charge anymore. The interesting thing is, and maybe is that I remember when the Labour Party last won, or certainly won in comparison to the previous government, if you see what I mean, or became the new government, 1997 is different. And I'm trying to put my finger on that, why it feels different. And I think the difference probably was the impact of Margaret Thatcher to my life, and where I come from, destroyed my city and various parts of the country where I came from by design or incompetence or whatever. So that was a massive impact. CO3 was less of an impact. It's different this time. The previous governments have been incompetent and corrupt, but they had no vision, and they certainly weren't going around destroying things, so they weren't even capable of it. And also, I suppose I'm a little bit concerned for my child because of the rise of, or the exposure of real right-wing fascism in the UK now. You know, and in the form of the Reform Party. They can call them what they like, but people who go around othering other people, calling for ludicrous things to be happening to other people, no proper systems of tax and spend, and just ludicrous expenses.
But what is the...
they're fascists, and they're not in Parliament.
Yeah. So just putting that to one side for a minute, one of the things that came out of the election was and it's not as if this hasn't happened before, the British electoral system, first past the post, doesn't necessarily mean that whoever gets a massive majority has a massive share of the vote, and that's happened this time. And in particular, with Reform whinging that they got a fairly high percentage of the vote, but only got a handful, literally you can count them on one hand, number of MPs. There's all this call now for having a more proportional representation, from these parties, the smaller parties, having a proportional representation or a change to the voting system, which, from my perspective, personally, I think is wrong. I don't think we would want something like that. Look what's happened to France, which has just had its general election, and they've got three parties all roughly on the same number of seats. One on the left, one in the middle, one on the right. And only the one on the right is one party. The one in the middle is a coalition of several parties, and the one on the left is a coalition of several parties. It just doesn't feel like there's going to be, in France, I don't think people are thinking there's going to be stability because of the way that the votes have, and I think that will be the same in the UK. I think that at least when you have a first past the post, all right, you've got 4 or 5 years for them to be in, but they're in and they can get things done. Having proportional representation is a recipe for having compromise, which isn't always the best thing. Not saying it's perfect, it certainly isn't.
No, but there are different types of proportional representation. It's there's the the interesting thing is, and I think you'd forgotten, the UK had a vote on this in 2011 as to whether to change the voting system, and it was an 80% no.
I know.
It's interesting that
I voted now. Yeah,
I think I did as well. I think the Reform Party are now asking for it to be that referendum is 15 years ago. Well, on that basis, we'll be having a new referendum on joining the EU in 7 years' time, shall we? Then I suspect it won't be so keen on that. Then, the interesting thing about the vote, I agree with you in principle. It's a part of me thinks it's unfair, but it really depends what the purpose of a general election is. Is it to vote in a government, or is it to taste the opinion of the electorate? I think you're right. I think it's to vote in a government. If its purpose is to vote in a government, pure, simple proportional representation, X votes equals X members of Parliament, isn't good. But there are other systems which are slightly more sophisticated. I say that, I don't know what they are. I mean, certainly in Scotland, it's not pure. You have a local vote, and then you have a second vote, which is then taken off a list. So you have 2 MPs essentially, one of which will never represent you, but represents your views in Parliament. So you have somebody you can go and speak to about the drains, and you have somebody who is representing your views. And then frequently people then use that second vote differently, which throws up interesting things. I mean, just going back to the election, people complain about the popular vote not relating to the number of MPs. Well, there's two or three things about that, isn't there? Is that the Liberals and the Labour Party deliberately targeted seats that they needed to win. So there's no point in piling up the votes in a constituency that always votes Labour, because you can only win once. So there's not, so if the Labour vote went down in some town that is staunch Labour for 100 years or 80 years, there's no point in doubling that vote. So there's no, so people voted tactically. People voted Liberal Democrat. Look at the number of Liberal, locally where they needed to get rid of the Tories, who would normally have voted Labour.
No, and to be fair, the media coverage of the Liberal Democrat gain has been significantly less than the Reform.
Yes, because the fascist mainstream media, non-mainstream media are full of fruitcases, but mainstream media are drawn to the flame of fascists because they're controversial. They're fruitcases themselves. They're frequently getting caught out the interviewers can catch them out. The interviewers can be shocked by their opinions. Nobody's shocked by the opinion of a liberal. Nobody's shocked by the fact that liberals are usually normal people who have with normal jobs. That doesn't make TV. So the mainstream, you got to look at America for goodness sake. Mainstream media is drawn to these controversial characters. But the interesting thing about their vote is that they've got this broad 15%, which is only a couple of percent as what they had 10 years ago under a different name. Reform used to be called UKIP. UKIP got 13% in the 2015 general election, and they got 15% being called Reform. But what they've done is drawn out all the racists in every constituency. So 50% of every town is racist. That's not a surprise to anybody. 50% of most, and most of those people are in their 60s because that's how they were brought up, like it or not. That's just the way it was. As I say 60s, I mean late 60s, 70s, 80s. And those people are dying off. I am slightly concerned through some of the stories I hear from my daughter's school. They had a mock election, and guess who won? Reform. Guess who voted? And this is in a reasonably middle class, middle of nowhere, 95% white area, most of whom have never seen an immigrant in their life. Why did they win? Well, interestingly enough, boys like Farage, because he's friends of that disgusting Andrew Tate misogynist who is being investigated for sexual assault and tax dodging and all the rest of it.
Great. I didn't realise that.
Well, and absolutely. It's through TikTok. They're drawn to misogyny because they can't get a girlfriend. The usual stuff. They're drawn to drill music, which in itself is racist, but is racist by people who do it against themselves. But if you pick up on the racism and you're not black and you spout racist nonsense, you are by definition a racist. You might say, well, that guy's singing about it. Yeah, but that guy's black. You're not black. So as soon as you start singing about it and espousing all these views, that makes you a racist. So I'm not saying every 15-year-old boy is a racist, but it's just enough. So I was chatting to various people on Twitter about this the other day. It's certainly in the UK, all schools do civic classes, how to be a citizen. The impact of toxic social media isn't currently on the curriculum. It needs to be. So I don't think I really don't think that's going to be a problem, but it needs to be addressed. And that's why I think this election around, because the country is in such a state, falling to pieces everywhere, mismanaged, nasty, corrupt individuals have been replaced. There's an awful lot of work to do. And the right.
Oh, yeah.
And I noticed just today, the first day when all new members of Parliament are back, I'm just glancing through the BBC Live feed, and there's two pictures of the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, and there's a picture of Nigel Farage. Why is he number 3 picture he's one MP out of 650. Why is he there? They can't help themselves. They just can't help themselves. And it's about time they got a grip of themselves. It's been predictable in a good way, but it doesn't feel like, it's hard to say rose-tinted spectacles. It felt like we knew that the Labour Tony Blair government would make a difference. It's not obvious this time because there's no money left. There's been 14 years of breaking everything. I mean, I'll give Major and Thatcher their due. They were serious people. They didn't break anything.
Well, I think one of the other things that's different this time from the Tony Blair one was that the Tories knew that they were going to lose. There were 70 resignations, or
yes, indeed,
people stating they weren't going to stand. And I was reading on the BBC, it was saying there were 360 new MPs out of the 635. I mean, that's unprecedented as well. Yeah, in terms of and I think that's one of the big differences. How that's going to play out, who knows?
Well, that should be a good thing, because if you're younger people, there is talk of closing the bars that sell alcohol in the Houses of Parliament, because why the hell should a place of... I did know that when we were in telecoms in the 90s, we bought a company called Telephone Rentals, which had a bar in it, but I don't believe it was, that was unusual. And as soon as Mercury Cayman Islands bought it, it was closed. So, I don't know how many public places of work have bars in them, never mind 5. There's only 600 people in the entire building already. There's more than that, because there's lots of hangers on. They're talking about closing the bars. All right, they'll just go to the local pubs. Yes, of course, that's what people do. But, so that should help. The sexism and all the cases of assaults and horrible...
Yeah.
Well, exactly. That's endemic in society, unfortunately. But yeah, certainly, hopefully, with this new breed of, or this new tranche of MPs, younger, more normal, because they're obviously biased, but they're not conservatives, which...
Well, obviously they're in a bit of disarray as well. So I mean, it's difficult to know what the Tories will do, because Sunak will leave. There'll be a new leader. They haven't got that many MPs. They don't know where they don't know what to do at the minute. So they might end up voting for somebody half decent in the sense that not a complete flipping.
Well, I've not seen a name yet. I'm not suggesting there aren't any, but I've not seen a name yet put up by the mainstream media that suggests, it's all the usual suspects. Braverman, who's been in America at some extreme right-wing conference spouting disgusting nonsense about gay people. The Kemi Badenoch, who is, on the face of it, it seems reasonably normal until she actually starts speaking and then blames everybody else for all the problems of the world apart from the current government or the ex-government. Jeremy Hunt seems normal, but he's not going to win. Penny Mordaunt was quite normal, but
didn't get voted. Yeah, she
was got to be in it to win it, and she's not in. There's a guy called Robert Jenrick who is actually quite a favourite to win. It's a complete personality black hole. So if absolutely personality black hole, charisma of nothing.
Yeah, but we've said that, but that's what they were accusing Starmer of.
No, there's personality black holes, and then there's unpleasant personality black holes. He's thoroughly unpleasant, and he resigned. I can't remember. He was the Minister for Immigration, and he resigned. He was the guy. This is how unpleasant he was. The guy that got the Immigration and Border Force to paint over Mickey Mouse murals at the Children's Reception Centre because he didn't want to encourage the children to come to the country. Interesting times.
Interesting times.
Seems to me that the adults are back in charge. That's not to say in 2 years' time there won't be lots of infighting because it's just the way human nature goes. But
no, that's right. So maybe at the end of Series 2, we can look back and say, well, this is...
See how it's going. I mean, they do say in an American thing, and American listeners, the first 100 days, of Parliament, hopefully by the first 100 days I'll have got rid of my 100-day cough. But but anyway, it's
we know the result. It's
it's
a lad
got to be better than what it was before in the alternative. But it's a
long and hard road. So we shall have to wait to see. And it's not going to. There are no quick fixes. There are no switches to flick. It's going to take years. But let's hope we get on the right path. Anyway, right. So that's it. End of Series 1. Hopefully, we'll start Series 2 in a month or two.
Get the holidays out of the way.
Get the summer holidays out of the way. Make sure that we've got our Facebook page up and running. We'll hopefully have a web page as well. One of the things that I will leave you with is that we do have a new advert for our podcast, which I will play. We've just got to figure out how we can utilise it and where we can force it on people to potentially listen to the ad and then maybe become regular listeners. Thanks for listening, and we'll speak to you again at the beginning of Series 2. So bye for now.
See you then.
History buffs, have you ever asked yourself, what if things happened differently in history? Then you will want to add Conversations in Time to your podcast playlist. Conversations in Time explores the what ifs of history. What if the United States didn't enter the First World War? What if Japan attacked the Soviet Union instead of the United States in 1941? What if the gunpowder plot of 1605 was a success? Hosts John and Ian cover these fascinating what ifs of history and more. They also explore everyday curiosities in their Whatever Happened To series. Conversations in Time is available on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube Music, Amazon Music, and Podbean. Add Conversations in Time to your podcast playlist right now, and make sure to share the podcast on all your social media so your friends can tune in too. History is full of fascinating what ifs. Conversations in Time. Start listening right now.
That's it.